If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Hebrews, the 10th chapter. This is where we will spend our time today. Everything about God's relationship with humanity changes. And that's the big feature, the big message, if you will, of the Advent season, is that something really dramatic is happening wherein God relates to humanity in a very, very different way. The plan of salvation comes to fruition in what Paul calls the fullness of time, a very powerful phrase carrying a lot of theology throughout its history. When the fullness of time was reached, in other words, the time in which God saw fit to enter into humanity in the way that he did. But there's a big comparison to be made, and that is, what of this fullness of time and salvation relative to all that had passed before in the Jews? What does it all mean? Because salvation is of the Jews. So let's take a look at our text. Hebrews chapter 10, I'll begin reading in verse 1. For the law possesses a shadow of the good things to come, but not the reality. And it is therefore completely unable by the same sacrifices offered continually year after year to perfect those who come to worship. For otherwise they would have not ceased to have been offered, since the worshipers would have been purified once and for all, and so have no further consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices, there's a reminder of sin year after year, for the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. So when Jesus came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but you prepared a body for me. Whole burnt offerings and sin offerings you took no delight in. Then I said, here I am, I have come. It is written of me in the scroll of your book to do your will, O God. When he says above, sacrifices and whole burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor did you take delight in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he says, here I am, I've come to do your will. He does away with the first to establish the second. By his will we've been made holy through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. And every priest stands in day after day serving and offering the same sacrifices again and again, sacrifices that can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered one sacrifice for sin for all time, he sat down at the right hand of God, where he is now waiting until his enemies are made a footstool for his feet. So what you've got in this little text is in essence the theological summation of what salvation actually is relative to the Jewish context from which it comes. And I would encourage everybody, this is very good reading, is Hebrews chapter 7 through 10. Just read it and as best as you can understand it, because then you will understand very clearly. There's fat books of theology written on just those passages wherein the connection between the Jewish sacrificial system and salvation is explained in those passages, in those chapters. And so it's very clear. God commanded all of the priesthood. He commanded all of the ceremonies. He commanded all of the ritualistic ways of doing it. He commanded the size of things. He commanded the color of things. He commanded the way in which it was to be done. He commanded the things that would be said. He commanded which way you were to sprinkle the blood. I mean, everything to the finest detail was commanded. And yet, this writer says it couldn't take away sin. What's going on? I mean, think of this writing and how a Jew would hear this writing read in the first century. Now, some people look at this text and they say, well, this shows us, and the reason for this is, the writer speaks of the Jewish context in both the present and past tense. And in other places in the letter to the Hebrews, the writer speaks that way of the Jewish context, the temple context. And so they say, well, obviously this is written after 70 AD, when the temple was torn down. I totally disagree with that. I don't think there's a single book in the New Testament, other than perhaps the book of the Revelation, that was written after 66. They were all written before 66, because what Jewish person would have not noticed the war, right? The Jewish wars and the tearing down of the temple. They would have written about that had they written after that. So I disagree with the scholarship that says this is after 70 AD. Most good scholars today place this around 65, and I'd say that's a fair assessment. The writer's unknown. We don't know who wrote it. Some people think Paul. That's possible. Some people think Barnabas. That's possible. Some people think Apollos, who was a very good Old Testament scholar. As a matter of fact, you read about Apollos and it says Apollos was winning people to Christ, and yet he'd not even been taught himself relative to the New Testament teachings. That's how good he knew the Old Testament. That's how able he was as a teacher. So Apollos is a good candidate. But however, whoever wrote it, for any practicing Jew to sit in the audience and hear this read in the way that it speaks would have just been unbelievable to them. You mean to tell me that the temple and everything that's been happening there for 1400 years, it doesn't mean anything? Wow. And God gave it. All the commands. They weren't, these bunch of Semitic people didn't just get together and figure out, let's do these things and maybe if there's a God, he'll like it. They didn't do that. These things were all commands. So you've got the whole priesthood, the Levitical line, everything swept away. It's gone. The issue of sacrifice for sin is settled forever, once and for all. And I think there's a huge message in there even for us, and that is we can't add anything to it. Salvation is something you reach out and take. We can't add to it. We can't do anything that makes it more effective other than just reach out and take the mercy that's offered. So all the centuries of the priestly practice, all of the detail, all of the fine-edged commands that were given by God relative to how sin was to be dealt with in the people was rendered useless insofar as the cross. This text tells us that it was all empty in a certain way. It goes even further than that. It says that God didn't even desire it. Think about that for a minute. He didn't desire that which he had commanded? No, he never desired it. In fact, all you've got to do is think about it from the context of the whole of the Bible. In the very first pages of it, he didn't desire that we should have sinned. And so everything that follows in order to make correction for that is something God never desired. It's just something that had to be done. So is it any wonder that Jews who listen to this kind of text would find conversion to Christianity very difficult? I can understand that. I mean, who wants to be told that everything you've been taught from childhood was empty in that sense? To discover that all that you were told the sacrifices were for weren't. They never took away sin. Well, why are we bringing these lambs and these doves and these bulls and these goats and all these animals twice a day to the temple to have them sacrificed for the sins of the people? Why on Yom Kippur the sacrifice is made, the Day of Atonement, for the sins of the people? The text tells you why. These things were a reminder of sin. They were never there to cure it. Wow. Then you got John the Baptizer who shows up. And he's the first chink in the armor here that we begin to see, because John, what does John do? He's not in the temple. He's not sprinkling blood. He's not wearing the ephod. He's not a priest. He's not even really he's qualified by lineage, but he's not a priest. He's out there at the river baptizing people for repentance of sin. What's that about? We've got a temple over there, John. We don't need you to do this. And yet, you see the people coming, and not just Jews. Centurions, pagans, they're coming to John to be baptized for the repentance of sin. So John, as the forerunner for Jesus, is already beginning to claw away at the temple system and to make it be seen for what it is, which is a shadow. Just a shadow. The writer here just flatly declares that none of this has any meaning before God relative to sin. Man, I just can't imagine being a Jewish person and hearing this. I mean, it would be so difficult. It'd be like somebody, like I said last week, what would it be for you or for me if someone were to come to us and with evidence that we could not refute, show us that everything we believed about Jesus was wrong, and that there was another way we're to look at all these things. That's how the Jew would hear this, except the Jew whose heart had been prepared by God to hear it. What was God doing in the temple? He was showing us and the Jews through time just how bad sin is. I'll just be honest here. I can't capture that in my head, how bad sin is. I wish I could. I mean, I know I feel bad about things that I've done and things that I've said, but I can't capture how God feels about it at all. I can't feel that. And I'm going to say the Jewish sacrificial system, now, some of you in this room are far more acquainted with the slaughter of animals than I am. And for you, maybe slaughtering a cow or slaughtering a pig or slaughtering a goat or whatever is just not that big a deal. I go to Kroger. So for me, I'm looking at something in a package, all nice and cut and sitting there. I recognize it's the color red, but I don't associate it with an animal in my head. I never have. I grew up in a very different location. But you better know that if you grew up, especially if you grew up in a Levitical household where your destiny as a male child was to eventually be a priest, and you saw the sacrifices every day, twice a day, they kept a whole herd of cattle, 250,000 head, available for the sacrificial system because the sacrifices had to be without blemish. So you got to do some pretty good picking twice a day. And a person who grows up in that from childhood would become eventually desensitized to what the message of the sacrifice is, which is this is how bad sin looks to God. We'd become desensitized to it, wouldn't we? I mean, anybody would. And then you get 1,400 years of that. I could see where the fullness of time was pretty ripe for some kind of change, for God to bring in a change. And there are lessons here. One of them is, do not ever think that what you and I are doing for God, we own it. Never. Never. 1,400 years, big temple over there, and God says, I'm done with that now, and I'm done with you. Your priesthood is over, unless you want to become a member of the kingdom of priests, following my last priest, Jesus. Man, that's a pretty radical message to hear as a Jew. And it points to some good things too, that if anything is being done for God by you or me or anybody, it's going to last until God is done with it. It's going to be there until God says it's over. And it tells me too that anybody who is surrendered to God, really, He'll use you. He's no respecter of persons. Now, God's work may not be obvious to us, and if we were around, just think about this, if you and I were around at the Advent, would we have noticed? I don't know how we would have. I mean, if I were Jewish at the time of Advent, would I have noticed that God was doing this new thing? Would I have noticed, heard about this baby being born in a manger to a virgin? Would I have noticed when Jesus grew up? Would I have noticed when He started to preach and teach and had followers? There were lots of rabbis around that had followers. Would I have noticed any of it? Would I have noticed when He was crucified? I don't know. I probably would not have. I probably would have been just as I am, very consumed with myself and the things that are important to me. And I would have not noticed any of that. And if I had sat in a crowd and heard this letter read, would I understand what it was saying if I were Jewish? I don't know. Imagine being a priest and being told everything you've ever done in your whole life was empty. It's a cataclysm. One of the things about salvation is that we do not capture well enough. Nancy touched on it, I think, when she said, I'm so thankful that Jesus came for me, for you. But we don't capture the cataclysmic nature of what that really means. I want to read something for you if I could, and I don't like to read in sermons, but I'm going to this time because I think this captures it. And this is the conversion story of if you take, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Surprised by Joy, and it is the story of his life, from childhood all the way until he becomes a believer. And this is the story of the night he recounts when he became born again. Here's what he says. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen College, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted from, even for a second, from my work, there came the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I earnestly desired not to meet. That which I feared greatly had at last come upon me, and in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in, and I admitted that God was God, and I knelt and I prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own 2 feet. But who can properly adore the kind of love that will open the high gates to a prodigal who is dragged in, kicking, screaming, resentful, struggling, and darting his eyes in every direction for a way of escape? The words compel them to come in have been abused by wicked people, and so we shudder at them, but properly understood, they plumb the depths of divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of people, and his compulsion is our liberation. Wow, that's a cataclysm. That's somebody who didn't even want to come, and yet they met God and came. And I think that's the cataclysm for all of us, but I think it dims as time goes on how cataclysmic it really is. God doesn't come to us and say, will you join my club? Or will you sign up for these activities? He doesn't say that. He says, I want you, and I want all of you, everything you are. And there's so much difficulty in that for so many, just like Lewis, because we are so geared to having utter autonomy of our own life. You hear this bandied about all the time in the political debate. Human autonomy, my rights to my own selfhood, however you want to describe it. But I'll tell you, and there is something like Lewis when he says this, when a person surrenders, it just feels so right. I remember in May of '82, I remember minding my own business, having lied to these people at this church that I was a Christian so that I could have the guitar gig, for 9 months lying to them about it. And then I remember that night when all of a sudden I just said, I can't take it anymore. And I got down on the floor in that apartment and I prayed. It was hard. But once I did, it felt so right. It's like conversion to Christianity, being a follower of Jesus, is so mysterious. It's such a mystery. And yet, when we finally surrender, all the mystery evaporates, and it just feels exactly right. We find ourselves invaded, but invaded in a very welcoming way. And everything that we thought and everything we were fearful of just goes away. That's what Advent does for humanity, if we're willing to accept it. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close.